Hi, this is Gene Preuss. In this video, we'll look at the wars that resulted between 1820 and 1848 over Texas and U.S. Western expansion and the effect it had on Mexican-American history. In this lecture, we aim to look at the circumstances that led to the Texas Revolution, the effects of the Texas independent movement on the Tejano population, and understand the role of manifest destiny and westward expansion. To begin with, let's look at some background information. We want to look at the unpopular 1819 Transcontinental or Adams-Onis Treaty. We want to look at U.S. expansionism and the Mexican claims. To do this, let's look first at the treaty. It was unpopular because many people in the American South especially believed that the United States gave up too much land to Mexico. What they had hoped for is instead of the boundary being the Sabine River, it would have expanded further into what's today Texas, down as far as Corpus Christi and the Nueces River. And there were many attempts we saw before the Adams-Onis Treaty to wrestle land away from Mexico, these filibuster attempts we talked about in the last lecture. Once the Panic of 1819, the Depression of 1819 happens, you have people who are very much in search of new economic opportunities, and Moses Austin's idea of settling U.S. residents into Mexico seemed like a very good idea and a win-win for both Mexico and Americans who were looking to rebuild their losses. And it tied in very well with the idea of U.S. expansionism. This idea of renegotiating the 1819 treaty line was also an official act. The United States sent representatives into Mexico to try to negotiate a treaty or to offer money in exchange for land that is now Texas. Poinsett was one of the first to do it, and when he was sent back to the United States, Anthony Butler continued those negotiations up to about 1846, to the point of annexation. Mexico, on its part, it wanted a buffer zone. It wanted to protect against hostile Native American tribes, especially the Apache and the Comanche, and also to protect against land-hungry Americans who they saw as bent on expansionism, which was true. And we saw that in the Mir y Terán expedition in 1828, there was an attempt to restrict the immigration that they had already allowed in once Moses Austin and other impresarios moved into Texas, and more Americans came in to settle in northern Mexico. There was an attempt to restrict that only increased frustration. This was also a time of revolution, and Texians were no different than other people who looked back at the American Revolution as kind of the origins of this revolutionary spirit of people being able to decide their own destiny. They saw it happen, of course, in the American Revolution. Many of them, or at least their forebears, their fathers, may have fought in the American Revolution. But there was also in Europe the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution. In Latin America itself, Mexico and others had been involved in independence movements to wrest control away from Spain. And, of course, in 1811, you see the beginnings of the Mexican independence movement for Mexicans to declare their independence from Spain as well. And the Texas Revolution, many felt, was the heir to all those other revolutions that were going on. As I mentioned earlier, after the Mir y Terán expedition, there was increasing frustration among the Texians, and these are the names that the U.S. settlers in Texas call themselves, the Texians, because it placed restrictions on further immigration, on slave importation, and some other restrictions on who could come in to the land of Texas and where they would be allowed to settle. What provoked even more rancor was Santa Anna returning to the Mexican presidency, reclaiming the presidency, and overthrowing the Constitution, throwing out the Constitution of 1824, which was essentially modeled on the U.S. Constitution. And this happened in 1834, 10 years later, that Santa Anna comes in and basically makes himself dictator. This creates within Mexico itself conflict between the centralist powers and the centralistas, as they were called, people who wanted power concentrated in the hands of the federal government, and the federalistas, who were who saw that the individual republics and states within Mexico should have more power. And this is even seen in Texas. For example, when William Barrett Travis from Alabama comes in and takes Fort Anahuac, this is over the frustrations between the Federalist, centralist struggle that you do see happening in the region of Texas. Frustrations are further amplified when Santa Anna sends General Coss to occupy San Antonio, and Coss then comes to the town of Gonzales and asks for the return of 2 cannon that Mexico had given to Gonzales for defense, and this prompts the challenge, the come and take it challenge. And then this leads to the siege of Bear, where Texians went to San Antonio and laid siege to the town in hopes and eventually forcing Coss to surrender. In 1835 and 1836, the independence movement was really gaining power, and by March of 1836, the Texas government declared itself independent from Mexico. Now, just 4 days later, the Battle of the Alamo takes place, and this is where many of the people who had laid siege and other reinforcements had come in and holed up in the Alamo. On March 6th of 1836, Santa Anna led troops into San Antonio, and they overran the Alamo and killed almost all the defenders. Few survived, and some news was sent to Sam Houston on March the 11th. And so then the Texian government knew that war was coming, that Santa Anna and his men were there to put down the rebellion. In Goliad, in South Texas, James Fannin and about 340 men surrendered. Some did escape, but they were massacred. 324 people were killed there. And you see on the left-hand side of the screen there the monument to the Goliad massacre that happened at the end of March. However, by April, Sam Houston had drawn Santa Anna far into what is now Houston, Texas, and the Battle of San Jacinto took place at the San Jacinto River, the mouth of the San Jacinto River, where it comes into Turtle Bay. And after the defeat of the Mexican forces there, the Treaty of Velasco was signed near Freeport, where Freeport is today, on May the 18th, between the provisional governor of Texas at the time, David Burnett, and Santa Anna. However, and this is a famous painting that you see that's in the state capital of Texas today. However, the Mexican government rejected the treaty. They did not say that it was a legitimate treaty because the president of Mexico, Santa Anna, was a prisoner of war at the time the treaty was signed, thus making the treaty, any treaty he signed, illegal. And so, in the end, there's a question of whether or not Texas was really independent. Although in Texas history, we like to think that it was, and we say that there was a republic, its own nation. However, Mexico never recognized Texas independence. Now, if we look at the American Revolution by contrast, shortly after the end of hostilities between Great Britain and the United States government, Great Britain, in a treaty of 1783, recognized U.S. independence. But Mexico never recognized Texas independence, and neither did the United States. Now, they thought that Texas acted independent, but they never officially recognized it. The only people that had diplomatic relations were the French and the English, and they had schemes of their own on the land and on keeping Texas either independent, acquiring the land for themselves, or at least destabilizing Mexico and the United States in their attempts to hold on to that territory. The legacy of the Texas Revolution, however, was felt by many of the Tejanos living in Texas at the time. Many were seen as being unfaithful, even though Tejanos had fought on the side of the Texians. There was a lot of animosity toward anyone of Mexican descent or anyone of Mexican heritage. For example, Juan Seguin, who was one of the survivors of the Alamo, he was sent out by Travis to get word to Houston that they needed help. And he was one of Sam Houston's trusted lieutenants during the Battle of San Jacinto. He later becomes mayor of San Antonio, but because of ethnic animosity, is branded a traitor and run out of town and had to leave and ended up fleeing to Mexico for his own safety. And he was not the only one. Other Mexicans, Tejanos living in the state, found that after the so-called independence, if that was true or not, they faced significant challenges and discrimination. Some of them were forced to flee. Their lands were confiscated, and it took legal lawsuits to try to get some of that land back. So they didn't fare well after, in fact, their population declined after Texas Revolution. This ties into the United States' attempt at expansionism. The new president, James K. Polk, had plans on accessing and acquiring, rather, that part of the Pacific Northwest, what's the United States today, Washington and Oregon. He was seen as the heir of Andrew Jackson, whereas Andrew Jackson was Old Hickory. Polk was called Young Hickory. He was an expansionist. And regarding the Oregon territory, he believed that the United States should get the land up past Vancouver Island into what's today Canada. This was the 5440 line, and his slogan was 5440 or fight. Great Britain was willing to recognize the boundary being the extension of the line of 1818. They wanted to just move that over to Vancouver Bay, the Bay by Vancouver. But Polk wanted more. Now, Polk really didn't. He was willing to negotiate, but he didn't think the British were serious about negotiating, so he threatened war with them. And so Great Britain capitulated, sent negotiators in, and the United States got what it wanted in 1846. Later that year, Polk sent a United States General Zachary Taylor to the Rio Grande. Now, this was disputed territory. And in May of 1846, Mexican troops came up to Brownsville across the Rio Grande. Shots were fired, although it's unclear who fired the first shot. But shots were fired, and Congress on May 13th declared war. Taylor was sent down there by Polk basically to provoke war. And in June, the very next month, a few weeks later, John C. Fremont, a mountain man and pathfinder and a member of the Corps of Engineers, and Kit Carson, the mountain man, invaded into California, northern Mexico at the time, from Missouri. There was also a United States fleet sent into the Pacific, sent into various ports in California, demanding their surrender. And that was, and then you also had Stephen Kearny, who moves into Santa Fe, New Mexico, and then heads over towards Los Angeles. So it was a multi-pronged attack on Mexico by United States troops in the middle of the summer of 1846. The war itself didn't last very long. This is the War of 1848, the U.S.-Mexican War. That's when it ends. What happens is Taylor moves south into Matamoros and then Monterey. Polk sends for Santa Anna, who's in Cuba, and brings him back with the hope that Santa Anna is going to reclaim the presidency of Mexico and ask for peace. But Santa Anna has different ideas, and once he gets back to Mexico, he continues the war. The end of the war happens after Mexico City is laid siege, when American troops move into Veracruz and Mexico City, and Mexican Congress, along with the president, Santa Anna, have to flee, and later on they're rounded up to sign the peace treaty. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the U.S.-Mexican War on February 2nd, 1848. In the treaty, among its provisions, was that the Rio Grande was now going to be the border between the United States and Mexico, thus securing for the U.S. all of the land that Texas claimed, that the Texians claimed, even though they never really had control of until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the United States also received the New Mexico territory and California. In exchange, the United States did pay Mexico $15 million for the land. But what else does it provide, and what does it mean for the Tejanos and for the other Mexicans living in the United States? We'll look at that in the next video. To recap, in this video, we looked at the circumstances leading to the war between Texians and the Mexican government, the Texas Revolution. And a lot of these were caused by the increased immigration, the Americanization of the Texas colony led to increased tensions between the Mexican government and the settlers there, as did Santa Anna's claim of dictatorship over Mexico. The Texas independence movement on the Tejano population was that they faced increasing marginalization throughout the period on into the 20th century. And we wanted to understand the role of manifest destiny and westward expansion. And this was not only U.S. policy and as well as public desire for more land to acquire good cotton growing land on the southern border of the United States and the northern border of Mexico, the area that's now Texas. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you'll join me for the next video.